I've been fighting on TV for the past 10 years, always defending myself. The past 10 years, if you really watch The Real Housewives of New Jersey.
Yeah.
And I'm just tired of fighting.
Level 1. Teresa Giudice. The cameras rolled as Teresa Giudice reached across that infamous dining table, her manicured fingers gripping the edge before sending plates, glasses, and dreams of reality TV fame crashing to the floor. Millions watched her lose control on The Real Housewives of New Jersey, but what they didn't see was the web of lies she was spinning behind the scenes. While America was entertained by her explosive temper and lavish lifestyle, Teresa was already deep into a scheme that would eventually land her in federal prison. Between 2001 and 2008, Teresa and her husband Giuseppe had transformed themselves into masters of deception. Though their stage wasn't a television set, it was the offices of banks and lending institutions across New Jersey. They had discovered that the American dream could be purchased with nothing more than fabricated documents and convincing lies. Each loan application became a performance, each false statement a carefully rehearsed line in their elaborate production. The Giudices didn't just bend the truth, they obliterated it entirely. When Teresa applied for a $121,500 mortgage loan in September 2001, she claimed to work as an executive assistant, earning a steady salary. The supporting documents looked authentic: W-2 forms, pay stubs, employment verification letters. But every single piece of paper was a forgery. Teresa had never worked for the company listed. The salary she claimed was a fantasy. The executive assistant position existed only in her imagination, and on the fraudulent paperwork she submitted to unsuspecting lenders. As her reality show fame grew, so did the complexity of her deceptions. The irony was staggering. While millions of viewers watched Teresa flaunt her wealth on television, she was simultaneously telling bankruptcy courts that she was financially ruined. The woman who threw elaborate parties and bought designer handbags by the dozen was the same person claiming she couldn't afford to pay her debts. The bankruptcy filing in October 2009 should have been Teresa's confession, her moment of financial transparency. Instead, it became her most audacious lie yet. She concealed the very income that had made her famous, the money flowing in from The Real Housewives of New Jersey, from personal appearances, from the cookbook deals and endorsement contracts that came with celebrity. While she was required by law to disclose every source of income to the bankruptcy court, Teresa chose to hide the fortune that reality television had brought her. But Teresa's most damaging decision wasn't what she concealed, it was what she said under oath. When bankruptcy officials questioned her about assets and income, she lied directly to their faces. These weren't accidental omissions or bookkeeping errors. These were deliberate falsehoods spoken in a federal courtroom, where perjury carries serious consequences. The house of cards began tumbling in July 2013, when federal prosecutors filed a 39-count indictment against Teresa and Giuseppe. The government had spent years building their case, following paper trails, analyzing bank records, and documenting every false statement the couple had made. What they uncovered was a pattern of fraud spanning nearly a decade, involving multiple banks and millions of dollars in fraudulent loans. During her sentencing hearing in October 2014, Teresa stood before federal judge Esther Salas and finally told the truth. "I am scared," she admitted, her voice breaking. "I'm a wife and a mother, but today I am humbled. I fully take responsibility for my actions." The judge sentenced her to 15 months in federal prison, calling her crimes a typical case of keeping up with the Joneses. Teresa had tried so hard to appear wealthy that she had committed multiple felonies to maintain the illusion. On January 5, 2015, Teresa walked through the gates of Danbury Federal Correctional Institution, trading her designer clothes for prison uniforms and her spacious New Jersey mansion for a shared cell. The woman who had made millions entertaining audiences with her over-the-top lifestyle was now inmate number 65703-050, serving time for the lies that had financed her fame. Level 2. Shah. Behind the designer outfits and carefully curated Instagram posts, Shah was orchestrating one of the most insidious fraud operations ever documented by federal authorities. While viewers of The Real Housewives of Salt Lake City watched her throw extravagant parties and engage in petty feuds with her co-stars, Shah was systematically targeting the most vulnerable members of society, elderly Americans, who trusted her slick sales presentations and paid devastating prices for that trust. Shah's operation wasn't some small-time scam run from her kitchen table. This was a nationwide network of deception that spanned nearly a decade, involving multiple call centers, hundreds of employees, and thousands of victims. From at least 2012 until her arrest in March 2021, Shah served as an integral leader of what prosecutors called a wide-ranging telemarketing fraud scheme. But calling it mere telemarketing was like calling a tornado a gentle breeze. The victims never saw Shah coming. They would receive phone calls from friendly-sounding representatives offering business opportunities, website development services, or coaching programs that promised to change their financial futures. The callers were skilled manipulators, trained to identify loneliness, desperation, and hope in the voices of potential marks. They knew exactly which words would convince a retired teacher in Iowa or a widowed farmer in Nebraska to hand over their life savings. Shah had perfected the art of selling nothing while making it sound like everything. Her companies offered business services that existed primarily on glossy brochures and professional-sounding websites. Victims paid thousands of dollars for website development that never happened, for business coaching that never occurred, for marketing services that never materialized. They were purchasing dreams from someone who specialized in selling nightmares. But Shah's true innovation was in what the industry called lead generation. She didn't just run one scam, she was the puppet master behind an entire ecosystem of fraud. Shah would sell lists of potential victims to other scammers, complete with detailed information about their financial situations, their vulnerabilities, and the specific approaches that might work on them. These leads were human beings reduced to data points, their personal information traded like commodities in Shah's criminal marketplace. The Federal Trade Commission had been investigating schemes like Shah's for years, but she adapted faster than regulators could keep up. When authorities shut down one operation, Shah would simply rebrand, relocate, and restart under a different name. She moved operations overseas, used shell companies to hide ownership, and required payments in cash to avoid creating paper trails. Each new incarnation was more sophisticated than the last. Even when dozens of her co-conspirators were arrested, even when she knew federal agents were closing in, Shah refused to stop. Instead, she escalated her efforts to cover her tracks. She directed employees to delete electronic communications, moved evidence beyond the reach of investigators, and continued operating her criminal enterprise right up until the moment FBI agents knocked on her door. The arrest came on March 30th, 2021, during filming for the second season of The Real Housewives of Salt Lake City. While Shah was supposed to be at a cast event, federal agents were instead placing her in handcuffs and reading her rights. The contrast couldn't have been starker. One moment she was playing a reality TV villain, the next she was facing real criminal charges that could send her to prison for decades. Shah initially maintained her innocence, hiring high-powered attorneys and claiming she was being scapegoated for crimes committed by others. But as her trial date approached and the evidence against her mounted, reality set in. On July 11, 2022, just 1 week before jury selection was scheduled to begin, Shah changed her plea to guilty. She admitted to conspiracy to commit wire fraud, acknowledging that she had knowingly participated in a scheme that defrauded thousands of people. The sentencing hearing on January 6, 2023, provided the first public glimpse of genuine remorse from Shah. Standing before Judge Sidney Stein, she finally acknowledged the human cost of her crimes. "I am deeply sorry for what I have done," she said, her voice cracking with emotion. "I take full responsibility for my actions, and I'm doing all I can to fix the harm I have caused." But her apologies couldn't undo the damage. Many of her victims had lost their retirement savings, their homes, their sense of security in their golden years. Judge Stein sentenced Shah to 6.5 years in federal prison, calling her an integral member of the decade-long fraud scheme. As she was led away to begin serving her sentence at federal prison Camp Bryan in Texas, Shah joined a facility that also housed other white-collar criminals, including Theranos founder Elizabeth Holmes and former Real Housewives stars who had committed similar crimes. Level 3. Martha Stewart. Martha Stewart had built an empire on the promise of perfection. Perfect homes, perfect parties, perfect lives available to anyone willing to follow her instructions. Her magazine taught millions how to fold fitted sheets and arrange flowers, while her television shows demonstrated the art of turning ordinary moments into extraordinary memories. But on December 27, 2001, the woman who preached about living well made a decision that would tarnish her carefully crafted image and send her to federal prison. The call came from her broker at Merrill Lynch while Stewart was flying to Mexico for a vacation. Peter Bogdanovic had urgent news about Imclone Systems, a biotechnology company in which Stewart owned nearly 4,000 shares. The stock was about to plummet, he told her, because the Food and Drug Administration was about to reject the company's new cancer drug. More importantly, he informed her that Imclone's founder, Samuel Waxall, and his family members were frantically selling their shares before the bad news became public. Stewart faced a choice that would define the rest of her life. She could hold on to her Imclone stock and lose money when the FDA announcement drove down the price, or she could use the insider information to sell her shares and avoid a loss of approximately $45,000. For someone worth hundreds of millions of dollars, the amount at stake was relatively insignificant. But Martha Stewart had not become successful by accepting unnecessary losses, no matter how small. The sale order was placed while Stewart was still on the airplane, selling all 3,928 shares of her Imclone stock at an average price of $58.43 per share. The timing was exquisite. The next day, when the FDA rejection was announced publicly, Imclone's stock price fell to $46 per share. Stewart had saved herself exactly $45,673 by trading on information that other investors wouldn't receive until it was too late. But Stewart's problems began not with the stock sale itself, but with the lies she told afterward. When investigators from the Securities and Exchange Commission came asking questions, Stewart concocted an elaborate cover story about a pre-existing agreement with her broker to sell Imclone shares if they fell below $60. She claimed the sale was based on this standing order, not on any insider information about the FDA's decision. The lie might have worked if Stewart had kept her story simple and consistent. Instead, she embellished it with additional details that investigators could easily verify. And when they checked, they found that no such agreement existed. Phone records, email communications, and trading documents all contradicted Stewart's version of events. Each lie led to more questions. Each answer created new inconsistencies, until Stewart found herself trapped in a web of deception of her own making. The investigation revealed the full scope of Stewart's deception. She had not only traded on insider information, but had also attempted to manipulate evidence to support her false story. She altered computer records to make it appear that her broker had left her a message about the $60 price target. She coached her assistant on what to tell investigators. She even attempted to sell additional Imclone shares to create the appearance that her trading was part of a larger pattern rather than a response to specific insider information. Federal prosecutors faced a decision about whether to charge America's most famous lifestyle guru with insider trading. The case was precedent-setting. Stewart wasn't a corporate insider like the Imclone executives, who were also selling their shares. She was an outsider who had received a tip from her broker, making her case different from typical insider trading prosecutions. But the government decided that Stewart's lies and obstruction of justice warranted criminal charges, regardless of the novelty of her situation. The trial that began in January 2004 captivated public attention in ways that surprised even experienced court observers. Stewart's every appearance became front-page news, her outfits analyzed by fashion experts, her demeanor scrutinized by body language specialists. She hired celebrity stylist Robert Isabelle to coordinate her courtroom wardrobe, treating her criminal trial like a carefully staged media event. But beneath the surface drama, prosecutors were methodically presenting evidence of Stewart's crimes. The jury deliberated for 3 days before reaching their verdict on March 5, 2004. They found Stewart guilty on 4 felony counts: conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and 2 counts of lying to federal investigators. They acquitted her of the most serious charge, securities fraud, but convicted her of the cover-up crimes that many legal experts considered more serious than the original insider trading. Judge Miriam Cedarbaum sentenced Stewart to 5 months in federal prison, 5 months of home confinement, and 2 years of probation. She also imposed a $30,000 fine, though for someone of Stewart's wealth, the financial penalty was negligible. What mattered was the prison sentence. America's domestic goddess would be trading her Bedford estate for a federal correctional facility. Stewart reported to Danbury Federal Correctional Institution on July 16, 2004, becoming inmate number 55170-054. The woman, who had taught millions how to create beautiful living spaces, was now confined to an 8 by 10-foot cell shared with another inmate. She worked in the facility's general cleaning crew, earning just 12 cents per hour for labor that was a far cry from the television productions and magazine photo shoots that had made her famous. Level 4. Anna Delvey. Anna Sorokin understood that in New York City, perception could become reality if you played the game with enough audacity and style. So she created Anna Delvey, a character so compelling that some of Manhattan's most sophisticated residents believed she was exactly what she claimed to be: a German heiress with a €60 million trust fund and connections to European high society. For nearly 4 years, from 2013 to 2017, Anna lived this lie so completely that she almost convinced herself it was true. The transformation began with small details that created massive impressions. Anna spoke with a vaguely European accent that sounded expensive and exclusive. She carried herself with the confidence of someone who had never worried about money, never questioned whether she belonged in 5-star hotels or exclusive clubs. Her wardrobe consisted of designer pieces that suggested unlimited resources, while her knowledge of art, culture, and business implied the kind of education that only serious wealth could provide. Anna's masterpiece was the Anna Delvey Foundation, an ambitious project that would have legitimately established her as a major cultural figure if it had actually existed. She presented investors with an 80-page business plan for a private members' club and arts foundation that would occupy a historic building in Manhattan's Soho district. The proposal was sophisticated and detailed, featuring partnerships with world-renowned artists and exhibitions that would have rivaled the city's major museums. The foundation wasn't just Anna's ticket to social acceptance. It was her vehicle for extracting millions of dollars from banks, investors, and wealthy individuals who believed they were getting in on the ground floor of the next great cultural institution. She convinced City National Bank to approve a $22 million loan application based entirely on fabricated financial documents that showed she had sufficient assets to cover the debt. When that loan was denied at the last minute, she pivoted to smaller targets who might be less thorough in their due diligence. Anna's daily life was an elaborate performance that required constant improvisation and risk-taking. She stayed in expensive hotels without the means to pay her bills, running up tabs that reached into the tens of thousands of dollars. When hotel managers demanded payment, she would wire transfer small amounts to buy time while claiming that larger payments were being processed through European banks. She cultivated relationships with hotel staff, tipping generously when she had cash and making promises about future generosity when she didn't. The Moroccan vacation that ultimately led to Anna's downfall was perhaps her most ambitious scam yet. She invited 3 acquaintances on an all-expenses-paid trip to La Mamounia, one of the world's most luxurious resorts, claiming that she wanted to share her wealth with friends. What she didn't tell them was that she had no intention or ability to pay for anything. When her credit cards were declined and her wire transfers failed to materialize, Anna convinced her friend Rachel Deloach Williams to put the entire $62,000 bill on her personal credit cards. Anna's promises to reimburse Williams were as fictional as everything else about her identity. For months after returning from Morocco, Williams received nothing but excuses and delays. Anna would claim that her trust fund was temporarily frozen, that her banker was traveling, that wire transfers from Europe took longer than expected. Each excuse bought her more time, but also deepened Williams's suspicion that she had been conned by someone she had considered a friend. The house of cards began collapsing when Williams contacted other people who had lent money to Anna and discovered that she had told each of them different stories about her family's wealth and her own background. Some believed her father was a diplomat, others thought he was an oil executive. Still others had heard he was a tech entrepreneur. The inconsistencies revealed that Anna's entire identity was a carefully constructed fiction designed to extract money from anyone gullible enough to believe her stories. Anna's arrest in October 2017 was orchestrated with the same dramatic flair that had characterized her entire scheme. Williams, working with law enforcement, arranged to meet Anna at a restaurant where police could take her into custody without causing a scene. When officers approached her table and placed her under arrest, Anna's reaction was not surprise or panic but annoyance, as if being arrested for fraud was an inconvenience that interfered with her social calendar. The trial that began in March 2019 became a media sensation that elevated Anna from a criminal defendant to a cultural phenomenon. She hired a stylist to coordinate her courtroom outfits, turning each appearance into a fashion statement that generated headlines and social media commentary. Anna understood that even criminal proceedings could be used to enhance her brand, that notoriety was just another form of fame that could be monetized. The jury convicted Anna on 4 felony counts, including theft of services and grand larceny, while acquitting her on the most serious charges related to the attempted bank fraud. Judge Diane Kiesel sentenced her to 4 to 12 years in state prison, noting that Anna had shown no remorse for her crimes and seemed to view her conviction as a temporary setback rather than a consequence of her actions. Anna served nearly 4 years in prison before being released on parole in February 2021. But her freedom was short-lived. 6 weeks later, Immigration and Customs Enforcement detained her for overstaying her visa, beginning a new legal battle over her right to remain in the United States. Even from detention, Anna continued to profit from her notoriety, selling the rights to her story for a Netflix series and maintaining an active social media presence that kept her name in the headlines. Level 5. Elizabeth Holmes. At 19 years old, Elizabeth Holmes dropped out of Stanford University with a vision that would either revolutionize healthcare or destroy her life. She had convinced herself, and would soon convince the world, that a single drop of blood could unlock the secrets of human health, detecting hundreds of diseases and conditions with unprecedented accuracy. The technology didn't exist, but Holmes possessed something more powerful than scientific knowledge: the ability to make others believe in miracles that existed only in her imagination. Holmes founded Theranos in 2003, with the audacious promise that her company had developed blood testing technology that would make traditional laboratory work obsolete. She claimed her Edison machines could perform comprehensive health screenings using blood samples so small they could be collected with a simple finger prick. The implications were staggering. Faster results, lower costs, and the democratization of healthcare for millions of people who couldn't afford expensive medical testing. The young CEO cultivated an image that borrowed heavily from tech industry mythology. She wore black turtlenecks in conscious imitation of Steve Jobs, spoke in an unnaturally deep voice that she claimed was natural, and surrounded herself with powerful board members who lent credibility to her impossible claims. Henry Kissinger, George Shultz, James Mattis, and other political heavyweights joined Theranos without understanding the science behind Holmes's promises. Their presence on the board became her most valuable asset, proof that serious people took her seriously. Holmes raised nearly $1 billion from investors who believed they were funding the next great medical breakthrough. She appeared on magazine covers, delivered TED Talks, and accepted awards as Silicon Valley's youngest female billionaire. The media celebrated her as a visionary who was democratizing healthcare, while investors valued her company at over $9 billion, based entirely on technology that had never been independently verified or peer-reviewed. But behind the carefully orchestrated public relations campaign, Theranos was a house of cards built on scientific impossibilities and desperate improvisation. The Edison machines that Holmes claimed could revolutionize medical testing actually existed, but they couldn't perform the functions she attributed to them. Of the hundreds of tests that Theranos marketed to patients, the company's proprietary technology could accurately perform only a handful. The rest were conducted using traditional machines from other companies, diluting the tiny blood samples to dangerous levels that compromised accuracy and endangered patient health. Holmes knew her technology didn't work, but she had built a company culture that prioritized secrecy over scientific integrity. Employees were required to sign extensive non-disclosure agreements that prevented them from discussing their work with anyone outside the company. Different teams were kept in isolation from each other, ensuring that no single employee understood the full scope of the deception. When Laboratory Director Adam Rosendorf raised concerns about inaccurate test results, Holmes dismissed his warnings and pressured him to keep quiet about the problems he had identified. The human cost of Holmes's deception became clear when Theranos began offering blood tests directly to consumers through partnerships with Walgreens and other retail chains. Patients received test results that were wildly inaccurate, leading to unnecessary medical procedures, improper treatments, and psychological trauma. One woman was told she had HIV when she didn't. Pregnant women received false information about their pregnancies. Cancer patients got results that could have affected their treatment decisions. Holmes had turned her company into a medical experiment conducted on unsuspecting patients who trusted that Theranos technology had been properly validated. The beginning of the end came in October 2015, when Wall Street Journal reporter John Carreyrou published an investigation that exposed the fundamental flaws in Theranos technology. Former employees, speaking anonymously due to their non-disclosure agreements, revealed that the company had been using traditional machines for most tests, and that Holmes had known for years that her proprietary technology didn't work as advertised. The article triggered regulatory investigations, investor lawsuits, and criminal charges that would eventually destroy the company Holmes had spent more than a decade building. Holmes responded to the mounting criticism with the same confidence that had characterized her entire career. She denied that Theranos technology was flawed, blamed disgruntled former employees for spreading misinformation, and claimed that competitors were orchestrating a campaign to destroy her company. She appeared on television shows, gave interviews to friendly journalists, and continued insisting that Theranos would vindicate itself through scientific results that never materialized. The federal criminal trial that began in August 2021 provided the first detailed public accounting of Holmes's decade of deception. Prosecutors presented evidence that she had knowingly misled investors, patients, and the media about Theranos' capabilities. They showed that she had forged documents, manipulated demonstrations, and lied repeatedly about partnerships with major pharmaceutical companies and military organizations. The government's case painted Holmes as a con artist who had used her charisma and connections to perpetrate one of the largest fraud schemes in Silicon Valley history. Holmes's defense strategy was as audacious as the crimes she was accused of committing. Her attorneys argued that she had been emotionally and sexually abused by her former boyfriend and business partner, Ramesh Sunny Balwani, who they claimed had controlled her actions and decisions. They portrayed Holmes as a victim rather than a perpetrator, someone whose judgment had been compromised by an abusive relationship that left her unable to understand the consequences of her actions. The jury rejected Holmes's abuse claims and convicted her on 4 felony counts of wire fraud and conspiracy. Judge Edward Davila sentenced her to 11 years and 3 months in federal prison, one of the longest sentences ever imposed on a tech executive for white-collar crimes. Holmes was ordered to pay $452 million in restitution to the investors she had defrauded, though that amount represents only a fraction of the total losses attributed to her scheme. Holmes reported to federal prison Camp Bryan in Texas in May 2023, joining an institution that houses other high-profile white-collar criminals, including Real Housewives star Jen Shah and Ghislaine Maxwell. The woman who had once graced magazine covers as a visionary entrepreneur was now federal inmate number 24965-111, serving time for crimes that had endangered the health and financial security of thousands of victims. Level 6. Ghislaine Maxwell grew up in a world where power was inherited, connections were currency, and wealth provided immunity from consequences that ordinary people faced. As the daughter of media mogul Robert Maxwell, she learned early that influence could be purchased, that reputations could be manufactured, and that the right introductions could open doors that remained forever closed to others. But the lessons she absorbed about privilege and entitlement would eventually lead her to become the key facilitator in one of the most extensive sex trafficking operations ever prosecuted in American courts. Maxwell's partnership with Jeffrey Epstein began in the early 1990s when she was searching for direction after her father's death and disgrace. Epstein presented himself as a successful financier with connections to powerful people in politics, business, and science. Their relationship was romantic at first, but it evolved into something far more sinister. A criminal conspiracy that would span decades and victimize dozens of young girls who trusted Maxwell's maternal facade and Epstein's promises of educational and career opportunities. Maxwell wasn't merely Epstein's girlfriend or social companion. She was the architect of his predatory system, the person who made his abuse possible by recruiting vulnerable girls and normalizing the sexualized environment that existed in his homes. Prosecutors would later describe her as Epstein's key facilitator, but that clinical language doesn't capture the calculated cruelty of someone who used her position as an adult woman to groom children for sexual exploitation. The recruitment process was methodical and sophisticated. Maxwell targeted girls from single-parent households, often those facing financial difficulties or family instability. She approached them at schools, shopping centers, and public spaces, presenting herself as a concerned older woman who wanted to help young people achieve their potential. She offered them educational opportunities, travel experiences, and connections to powerful people who could advance their careers. What she was actually offering was entry into a system of abuse that would traumatize them for life. Maxwell's grooming techniques were particularly insidious because she understood how to exploit the trust that victims naturally placed in adult women. She would take girls shopping, treat them to expensive meals, and discuss their hopes and dreams as if she genuinely cared about their futures. She normalized inappropriate behavior by being present during massages that Epstein received from the girls, suggesting that such activities were normal and acceptable. She gradually introduced increasingly sexualized situations, conditioning her victims to accept behavior that they initially found uncomfortable or strange. The scope of Maxwell's operation was international, with abuse occurring at Epstein's properties in New York, Florida, New Mexico, and the Virgin Islands, as well as at Maxwell's own residence in London. She facilitated travel arrangements, coordinated schedules, and maintained the infrastructure that allowed Epstein to abuse multiple victims across different jurisdictions. Her organizational skills and social connections transformed what might have been isolated instances of abuse into a systematic operation that continued for decades. Maxwell's relationship with powerful figures provided protection for the trafficking operation and legitimacy for Epstein's social position. She introduced him to members of the British royal family, American politicians, and prominent business people who either didn't know about his criminal activities or chose to ignore them. These relationships created a protective shield around both Maxwell and Epstein, making it difficult for victims to be believed when they tried to report their abuse. When Epstein was first arrested and convicted in 2008, Maxwell could have ended her involvement in his criminal activities. Instead, she continued facilitating his abuse of young girls, helping him rebuild his social network and resume the activities that had led to his initial prosecution. Her decision to continue supporting Epstein after his conviction demonstrates the calculating nature of her criminal choices and her lack of regard for the welfare of his victims. Maxwell's arrest on July 2, 2020, came nearly a year after Epstein's death in federal custody, while awaiting trial on sex trafficking charges. Federal agents found her hiding at a remote property in New Hampshire, where she had been living under an assumed name while attempting to avoid prosecution. Her efforts to evade capture included wrapping her cell phone in aluminum foil to prevent tracking and using elaborate security measures that suggested she understood the serious nature of the charges she was facing. The trial that began in November 2021 provided the first comprehensive public accounting of Maxwell's role in Epstein's trafficking operation. 4 women testified about abuse they had suffered as minors, describing how Maxwell had recruited them, groomed them, and facilitated their abuse by Epstein. Their testimony revealed the sophisticated psychological manipulation that Maxwell had used to control her victims, and the lasting trauma that her actions had caused. Maxwell's defense strategy focused on portraying her as another victim of Epstein's manipulation rather than his criminal partner. Her attorneys argued that she was being scapegoated for Epstein's crimes and that prosecutors were holding her responsible for actions committed by someone else. They suggested that her relationship with Epstein had been characterized by his control over her rather than their mutual participation in criminal activities. The jury rejected Maxwell's victim narrative and convicted her on 5 felony counts, including sex trafficking of a minor and conspiracy charges related to her recruitment and grooming activities. Judge Allison Nathan sentenced her to 20 years in federal prison, calling her crimes heinous, and noting that Maxwell had shown no remorse for her actions. The sentence represented one of the longest prison terms ever imposed on a woman for sex trafficking crimes. Maxwell was initially housed at the Metropolitan Detention Center in Brooklyn, where she complained about poor conditions and claimed that she was being treated unfairly compared to other inmates. She was later transferred to federal prison Camp Bryan in Texas, a minimum security facility that also houses Elizabeth Holmes and other high-profile white-collar criminals. Her current release date is projected for 2037, when she will be in her mid-70s. Level 7. Imelda Marcos. Before there were Swiss bank accounts filled with billions in stolen money, before there were shoe collections that would become symbols of excess and corruption, before there was a dynasty built on plunder, there was simply Imelda Romualdez, a beauty queen from a politically connected family in the Philippines who understood that marrying the right man could transform personal ambition into national-scale theft. When she became Ferdinand Marcos's wife in 1954, she was positioning herself not just for social prominence, but for participation in what would become one of history's most extensive kleptocracies. The Marcos dictatorship lasted 21 years, from 1965 to 1986. And during that time, Imelda evolved from political spouse to criminal mastermind. She held multiple government positions that gave her direct access to public funds: Governor of Metro Manila, Minister of Human Settlements, and member of the interim parliament. Each role provided new opportunities to divert money from government projects into personal accounts, to demand kickbacks from contractors, and to treat the Philippine treasury as her private bank account. Imelda's spending was legendary even by the standards of corrupt dictators' wives. She purchased a 175-piece art collection that included works by Michelangelo, Botticelli, and Monet, paying for masterpieces with money stolen from one of the world's poorest countries. She owned properties in Manhattan, including a townhouse that Jeffrey Epstein's attorney gave her for free as part of their business relationship. She collected jewelry, designer clothes, and luxury items with the compulsive intensity of someone who understood that her access to unlimited funds might not last forever. But Imelda's true genius was in creating sophisticated money laundering networks that moved stolen funds out of the Philippines and into accounts that would be difficult for future governments to recover. Between 1978 and 1984, while serving as Metro Manila governor, she established Swiss foundations using aliases and false documentation. These weren't simple bank accounts. They were complex legal structures designed to hide the origin of the money and make recovery nearly impossible for Philippine authorities. The amounts involved were staggering, even by the standards of international corruption. Conservative estimates suggest that the Marcos family stole between $5 and $10 billion during their time in power, though some economists believe the actual figure could be as high as $30 billion when accounting for wealth accumulated since the 1950s. To put this in perspective, the Marcoses' stolen wealth could have paid off the entire foreign debt of the Philippines during the 1980s economic crisis. Imelda's role went beyond simple theft. She was instrumental in maintaining the political coalition that kept her husband in power, using stolen money to buy loyalty from military officers, politicians, and business leaders who might otherwise have opposed the dictatorship. She distributed cash payments, lucrative government contracts, and business opportunities to ensure that powerful figures had financial incentives to support the regime. The corruption wasn't just criminal, it was the foundation of political control. The human cost of the Marcos dictatorship extended far beyond financial theft. Under martial law, which Ferdinand Marcos declared in 1972, thousands of Filipinos were tortured, killed, or disappeared for opposing the regime. Imelda was not a passive observer of these atrocities. She was an active participant in a government that used terror to maintain power. A Hawaiian court would later find the Marcos estate liable for human rights violations and award $2 billion to more than 9,000 victims of the regime's brutality. When the Marcos dictatorship finally collapsed in 1986, Imelda fled the Philippines with her family aboard U.S. Air Force helicopters, carrying suitcases filled with cash, jewelry, and other valuables. The opulent lifestyle that had defined her time as First Lady came to an abrupt end as she found herself in exile in Hawaii, facing potential prosecution for crimes committed during 2 decades of plunder and oppression. The evidence of Imelda's corruption was overwhelming and undeniable. Investigators found rooms full of designer shoes, warehouses packed with unopened luxury items, and financial records documenting the systematic theft of public funds. The sheer scale of the evidence made prosecution seem inevitable, but Imelda possessed advantages that ordinary criminals lacked: political connections, expensive lawyers, and enough stolen money to finance sophisticated legal defenses. Imelda's first major trial took place in New York federal court in 1990, where she was charged with racketeering, conspiracy, mail fraud, and obstruction of justice. The case attracted international attention as prosecutors attempted to prove that the former First Lady had used her position to steal money and launder it through American financial institutions. Despite overwhelming evidence of her crimes, Imelda was acquitted on all charges after her defense team successfully portrayed her as a victim of her husband's decision-making rather than an independent criminal actor. The New York acquittal emboldened Imelda to return to the Philippines in 1991, where she faced dozens of additional criminal and civil cases related to her time in government. She ran for political office despite her legal troubles, eventually winning election to Congress and later launching unsuccessful campaigns for president. Her political comeback demonstrated the Philippines' inability to hold powerful figures accountable for crimes committed during the martial law period. On November 9, 2018, more than 30 years after the fall of the Marcos dictatorship, a Philippine court finally convicted Imelda on 7 counts of graft related to the Swiss Foundation scheme. The court sentenced her to imprisonment ranging from 6 to 11 years for each count, totaling a minimum of 42 years in prison. She was also disqualified from holding public office, though she remained free on bail while appealing her conviction. Today, at 94 years old, Imelda Marcos has never served a day in prison for crimes that prosecutors say cost the Philippine people billions of dollars and contributed to decades of poverty and underdevelopment. Her case represents the ultimate failure of the international justice system to hold kleptocrats accountable for grand corruption. While her co-conspirators in lower-level schemes have been prosecuted and imprisoned, the architect of one of history's largest theft operations remains free, protected by age, political connections, and a legal system that has proven incapable of delivering justice to the victims of her crimes. 7 levels of deception. 7 different paths that led from wealth and privilege to prison cells and shattered lives. What connects Teresa Giudice's bankruptcy fraud to Imelda Marcos's billion-dollar kleptocracy isn't just the scale of their crimes, it's the way each woman used her advantages as weapons against the very society that had elevated her. These cases reveal a disturbing truth about how privilege can corrupt. Each woman possessed resources that most people can only dream of: money, connections, social status, public platforms. They could have used these gifts to build businesses, support charities, or create lasting positive change. Instead, they chose to exploit their advantages, turning trust into theft and influence into criminal conspiracy. If this deep dive into the psychology of white-collar crime has captivated you, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss our investigations into the dark side of wealth and power. Leave a comment below telling us which case shocked you the most, and don't forget to share this video with anyone who thinks money can buy immunity from justice. The progression from level 1 to level 7 shows how deception escalates when consequences fail to match crimes. Teresa Giudice served 15 months for stealing millions. Imelda Marcos stole billions and has never spent a single day behind bars. The lesson is clear. The more sophisticated the crime, the more likely its perpetrator is to escape meaningful punishment. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of these cases is how each woman continued lying even after being caught. They blamed others, claimed victimhood, and showed little genuine remorse for the people they had harmed. Their privilege had insulated them from consequences for so long that even criminal convictions couldn't penetrate their sense of entitlement. Today, some of these women remain in federal prison, serving sentences that may keep them locked away for decades. Others have completed their terms and returned to lives of relative comfort, their wealth largely intact despite their criminal convictions. A few continue fighting legal battles that may outlast their natural lives, protected by appeals processes and technicalities that money can buy. The victims of their crimes, the defrauded investors, the exploited elderly, the manipulated patients, the trafficked minors, the looted nations, continue living with consequences that will never fully heal. Their stories remind us that white-collar crime isn't victimless, that financial fraud destroys lives just as surely as violent crime, and that the pursuit of justice doesn't end when a gavel falls in a courtroom. These 7 levels of deception serve as a warning about what happens when privilege becomes predation, when wealth transforms into weapon, and when society's most advantaged members decide that rules apply only to other people. The women in these cases had everything, and chose to risk it all for even more. Their decisions didn't just destroy their own lives. They shattered the trust that holds civilized society together, proving that sometimes the greatest threats come from those we have the least reason to suspect. The scales of justice may be blind, but they are not broken. Each of these women eventually faced consequences for their choices, even if those consequences took years or decades to arrive. Their stories prove that no one, regardless of wealth, status, or connections, is truly above the law. But they also demonstrate how much damage can be done while justice slowly, methodically builds its case. In the end, these aren't just stories about crime and punishment. They're cautionary tales about the corruption of the American dream, the dark side of ambition, and the price that society pays when privilege becomes permission to prey upon others. 7 women. 7 levels of deception. 7 reminders that the most dangerous criminals are often hiding in plain sight, wearing designer clothes and living in mansions, using their advantages to exploit the very people who trusted them most.